Feels so good to get out of the house, guys. Thank you so much for dragging me along.
You need it after everything you've been through this week. And don't even think about bringing up you-know-who.
Yeah, Jared is a huge jerk. You could totally do better.
Hey, terrible day, huh? More like terrible week. Starbucks messed up our drink order, we can't fit into our skinny jeans, and Jared broke up with us 2 days ago. Just remember, everything happens for a reason. We just have to find the silver lining.
I just don't even know how to function anymore.
Girl, don't you even. You know God ain't gonna give you any more than you can handle.
I don't know, maybe that's true, but I just can't go on.
Oh my gosh, Candace. When God closes a door, he opens another one. Bye-bye, Jared. Hello, Stefan. See, we just need to remember that if God closes a door, he'll open another one. And if he closes that door, he'll open another one. And if he closes that one, he'll open another one. And if he closes that one, he'll open a window.
Job 38 is where we are going to start today. We're wrapping up a series that we've been in for the last several weeks called Bad Medicine, talking about how to avoid misery malpractice. We've been looking through the life of Job and the story of Job, who's a guy in the Old Testament. We've said about Job, Job's a guy who experiences just about every kind of suffering that you and I could imagine experiencing. He experiences the trauma of just an immediate trauma that causes suffering in his life. In one afternoon, Job loses his house, he loses his family, he loses his businesses, and he loses all of his money, and it happens in an afternoon. So some of you that have experienced just immediate trauma of one kind or another, Job knows what it's like to live through that. But as if that wasn't enough, before too long, Job also loses his health. And he suffers through this prolonged period of months or maybe even years of just misery that seems like it's never, ever, ever going to stop. And as a result of that, Job and some of his friends, they all gather together to do what you and I tend to gather together to do. When we're suffering or people that we love are suffering, they go to work trying to figure out a reason that Job is suffering so severely. They try to diagnose his pain so that they can come up with a treatment plan for his pain in hopes that the pain will go away, that the suffering will stop. The problem is the answers that they come up with, because we know the beginning of the story and we know the end of the story that they don't know, is bad medicine. And it makes the misery that Job's experiencing even worse as a result of what they're doing. We know how the story begins. We know what God says at the very end. And the double bad thing is not only is it bad medicine for him, it tends to sound awfully familiar. And we've said this all the way along. If you were to just open up the book of Job and read in the middle at some of the answers that some of these friends give for why Job is suffering, or some of the things we said last week that Job says about who God is in the middle of his suffering, it would sound awfully familiar to us. It's the kind of thing that we say to each other and we say about ourselves and that we say about God when we hurt. The friends come to Job and they say, Job, nobody suffers senselessly in the world. So if you're suffering, there's an explanation. And the explanation is either something that you've done wrong or something that you haven't done right. So it's either karma, the fruit that you're getting is due to the root that you planted. You deserve this, you did something bad, or it's a result of bad faith. You didn't do enough right, and because you didn't do enough right, God's getting you back. The problem is we know the story. We know the problem isn't anything that Job's done wrong. God's not angry with Job. In fact, God's proud of Job. God knows who Job is. He knows where Job is. He knows Job's name. He knows Job's heart. And God talks about Job like proud dads talk about their kids. The problem isn't that Job's in trouble with God. Job knows that. Not that the suffering that he's experienced isn't it due to something that he's done wrong. So he decides maybe the problem is something to do with God. And he goes to work diagnosing his pain and looking to heaven and saying, well, maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe the problem is that God is unapproachable. Maybe the problem is that God is unjust. Maybe the problem is God's unaware or unavailable. And yet again, we know this story from the beginning. We see something that Job can't even see. We see it from the perspective of heaven, and we know that God is aware, he's available, he's approachable, and he's just, even though Job can't see it. It's bad medicine that Job practices, and he practices it on himself, sort of like do-it-yourself dentistry. And yet in Job's case, and if you've ever done this to yourself, you know in your case, it can be even more painful than that. This morning, here's what I want to do. I want to tie a bow on this series, but here's what I don't want to do. I don't want to tie a bow on suffering. Because the Bible never ties a bow on suffering. God doesn't tie a bow on suffering. And in fact, the book of Job doesn't tie a bow on Job's suffering. The Bible doesn't give us simple answers or neat and clean platitudes or pithy sayings that we can just say and make the suffering go away for ourselves or the people around us. It gives us hope and it gives us comfort, but even hope and comfort, we're going to see this morning, don't always come from the place that we just assume that hope and comfort have to come from. See, over and over and over in the book of Job, Job has a question that he wants to ask God. And he just says, if I could only speak with God, I think I could get face to face with him. I got some questions for him. In fact, really, I just have one question for him. And it's a question that all of us ask when we suffer senselessly or when the people around us that we love suffer senselessly. The question that we always want to know the answer to is, why? Why are we suffering the way that we're suffering? We want to know why. And over and over and over, Job says, I want an explanation. And if I could get face to face with God, I would ask him a question. It's just one question. But God, I want to know why. Well, in Job chapter 38, God shows up on the scene. And by Job 42, we're going to see Job has a restored confidence in God. But it's not because he gets an answer to the question. Doesn't come from the place that you would think. God shows up like Job wanted, but Job never gets around to asking the question why. In fact, as far as we know, for the rest of Job's life on earth after these moments, another 140 years after the conclusion of the book, Job never gets the answer to why. Here's what we're going to see today. It's a good thing. And Job finds something even better than his answer to why. At least for Job, the answer that he gets is enough. Look at Job chapter 38, verse 1. Job chapter 38, beginning in verse 1, says this, Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. Okay, stop right there for just a second. If you've been reading through the book, you've started to notice hints that there's a storm appearing literally on the horizon. Job can see it coming. Job's friends can see it coming. The clouds were gathering on the horizon. The wind was starting to blow. The air had that feeling that the air sometimes gets when you know it's time to go inside. The clouds had started to gather on the horizon. And you got to remember at the beginning of the story, it was a storm that took out Job's family. It was a storm that took out Job's businesses, that ruined his finances and took his wealth. It was a storm that started this whole thing. And Job's friends, probably Job himself, felt like it was only a matter of time till the storm that was gathering on the horizon showed up to finish Job off. Job and Job's friend believed that it was the vehicle for God's punishment on sin at the very beginning. And it was only a matter of time until God came and finished the job on Job. In fact, Job said in Job chapter 9, when he asked for a meeting with God face to face, he said, the problem with a meeting with God face to face is if I summoned him and he showed up, he would crush me with a storm. And as Job and his friends see the storm gathering on the horizon, they all imagine that it's going to be the end of Job. And sure enough, Job chapter 38, here comes the storm that Job and his friends have seen on the horizon. And since Job's friends are all experts on God and who God is and what God does and how God has to act when God has to accomplish his plan, when they see the storm coming, they know with certainty what it is, why it's coming and what to expect, because they know everything. And yet in Job 38, when the storm shows up for Job, God doesn't destroy Job in the storm. And in fact, at the end of the storm, Job finds himself comforted. In fact, he tells us at Job 42 that he takes back his why. But it's not because God answered it. In fact, Job never gets a chance to ask the question. Because for the next couple of chapters, starting in Job 38, God has some questions for Job. Look at verse 2. Job 38, verse 2. God asks this, Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you. You shall answer me. God says, who is this confusing what I'm doing by explaining things that you didn't understand? Brace yourself, and this is an important phrase, brace yourself like a man. He's saying, Job, you and your friends have been bracing yourself like a god for a long time now. But I want you to brace yourself like a man for a little while. You brace yourself like a god, like you know the kinds of things that I have to do if I'm able. The kind of things that I'd always do, that I'm obligated to do if I'm good. You know how everything works together, where everything's going. You've braced yourself like you're me. But Job, you're not me. So brace yourself like a man for a little while. I got some questions for you. Look what he says, verse 4. Where were you, Job, when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together, and all the angels' shouts for joy. Just in a couple of verses, you see 5 questions that God asks Job. It's just the first 5 of more than 70 questions that God asks Job over the next couple of chapters. And here's what God's not saying. You can't read them this way. God's not saying, shut up, Job. I'm bigger than you, so I make the rules. Stay in your lane. It's not what he's saying. He's saying, Job, there are 10 million things about running the world that you don't understand. But I know completely. I'm not confused, Job, by the things that confuse you. You got to understand that. I know the answers to questions that you haven't even thought to ask yet, Job. I designed the universe. I know how it works together. I know how it functions in ways that you haven't ever thought of. And here's the deal, Job. Because of who I am, you can trust me. A bunch of you that attend doxology are aeronautical engineers. It would be like one of you, or an aeronautical engineer, taking your kids over to Lockheed Martin to watch the F-35 take off. And as you sat there with your kindergartner, watching this plane taxi down the taxiway and complete its run-up and move into position on the runway, your kindergartner looking at you, the aeronautical engineer, and saying, Mom, Dad, that thing's never getting off the ground. Like I can just tell, I can just feel it. It's too heavy. You screwed up. You didn't build it right. It's not going to work. What would you do in that moment with your 6-year-old? Well, you could turn to them and say, well, child, you don't understand the Bernoulli principle. Let me explain to you the Bernoulli principle. Let me explain to you a little bit about jet propulsion. I studied in college. I'll give you a little college education. Let me talk to you about aerodynamics and the theories of aerodynamics and give you a lesson on it, and then you'll be convinced that the plane's going to take off. But you wouldn't do any of that with your 6-year-old. You'd just look over at your 6-year-old and say, hey, bud, there's a lot about this that you don't understand, that I understand. And here's the deal. It doesn't seem possible, but it is. And here's the thing. I want you to see something amazing. So just sit here beside me and keep watching. But Mom understands something. Dad understands something you haven't even thought of yet. Trust me and keep your eyes open. I want to show you something. That's essentially what God takes 3 chapters to say to Job. And that's important for some of us to take into account, not just on suffering, but especially when it comes to suffering. Some of us, we've got this posture about our life and about God that says, I don't understand why God would fill in the blank. It doesn't make sense to me, so I won't believe in God as a result. I can't come up with a good explanation, so I know with certainty there can't be a good explanation. You know, God asked Job more than 70 questions to blow Job's mind with God's wonder and God's bigness and God's power and God's wisdom, so that Job will realize to say God has to make sense before I'll be willing to trust him, doesn't make any sense. To say I have to understand everything that God is doing before he's allowed to do it puts us in the wrong seat. If we serve a God who's big enough and strong enough, powerful enough to be angry at because he's not doing something that we can't do, he's not stopping something that we can't stop, then you have a God that's big enough and powerful enough and strong enough and maybe wise enough to have reasons for not doing it, to have reasons for allowing it that you and I can't possibly begin to fathom because we're people. We're not God. Does that make sense? Here's the lesson for Job in these 3 chapters. God's inviting Job to understand, never trust a God you can fully understand and control. You should never trust a God that you can fully understand and control. If your God only ever does what you would do if you were God, if he only ever permits what you would permit if you were God, only ever works the way that you would work if you were God, then you have a God who's smaller than you, or at least the same size as you. And a God that's smaller than you or the same size as you should never be trusted with you. A God worth trusting is always going to have to be trusted. Some areas that are mystery. A plan that we can't fully comprehend or put together. And that's good news for Job. It's good news for you and me too. You know the other thing that God shows Job and shows us? It's the second thing I think we see in these 3 chapters, really important for us to keep in mind even when we're suffering. It's this: uncertainty is not unchristian. Uncertainty is not unchristian. I don't understand is not the same thing as I don't believe or I can't believe. And you notice this all the way through the book of Job, and you notice it in God's responses to Job. God never, ever, ever rebukes the questions of Job or his friends. You know what God does? God rebukes the conclusions of Job and his friends that are not based on truth. When Job and his friends move from questions about things they don't understand to conclusions about things that they don't understand, that's when they get the rebuke from God. Questions aren't unchristian. When your uncertainty leads you to wonder the plan of a God who's bigger than you, your questions of God don't dishonor God. They declare that you realize he's bigger than you are. When it comes from the right heart, why? And I don't understand can be declarations of worship and confessions of faith. Things like suffering, it's not uncertainty. It's often our certainty that leads us to elevate ourselves above God and to sit as his judge, what he's allowed to do or plan or perform in a world like ours. And really, when it comes down to it, a lot of times for us, an explanation is only a substitute for trust. We want to know why, and we want to know why now, so that we don't have to trust him any longer. God loves us too much to let us live with a posture like that. See, God doesn't ever answer the why question for Job. But for Job, the who becomes so big and so sufficient that Job realizes he doesn't even need to know why anymore. Which, can I remind you, is what God told the enemy would be the case at the very beginning of the story. The only reason, that's what the enemy said, the only reason that Job worships you, God, is because you give him everything that he wants. You realize, at least in Job's case, if God had explained the why to him, it would have been a victory for the enemy. I mean, think about this. Imagine God had come to Job at some point in the middle of his suffering, or at the beginning of the story, and said, here's the thing, Job, you're going to suffer. In fact, it's going to be bad. It's going to be real, real bad for you. But before too long, I'm going to make you rich again. You'll double your money. You'll double your businesses. You'll have a family again. In fact, you're going to live to see your great-great-grandchildren. And in fact, Job, 4,000 years from now, there'll be a couple of thousand people that gather together in Fort Worth, Texas to talk about what an extraordinary man you were. But you're going to have to suffer a little while first. You know, there's a strong chance that Job says, okay, God, like I can deal with that. I'll suffer for that. And then the enemy would say, see, God, he doesn't really trust in you. He doesn't really worship you. He trusts in him. He worships him. He's satisfied with the explanation, but it's not worship. He's just willing to delay his gratification. You're a tool for him, God. It's purely transactional for him. He's just willing to be patient on you to endure a little bit of pain along the way to the prize. The enemy wins. And we would have believed that too. Job's far more righteous than that. And the only way we know, God never told him why. And he chose to worship anyway. Even without knowing why, Job decides that a bigger understanding of who is enough to leave his why on the table. And in fact, he says that. Flip over to Job 42. God completes his 70 questions and Job begins to speak up. At the end of the day, when God blows Job's mind with how big God is, it does three really important things for Job, and it can do the same thing for us. I want to show you what they are. Look at Job chapter 42, beginning in verse 1. Job chapter 42, beginning in verse 1, says this, Then Job replied to the Lord, I know you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You ask, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now and I'll speak. I will question you. You will answer me. My ears had heard of you. Now my eyes have seen you. He says, I'm an idiot. I thought I knew you before, but wow, I really know you now. I see you more clearly than I've ever seen you before. Therefore, verse 6, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Okay, I despise myself is probably not the very best translation of that Hebrew. The very best way to translate that verse in the Hebrew, he literally says, I reject myself. I reject myself. What he's saying there, if you've followed the whole book, it kind of takes this courtroom scene where he gets ready to stand up and he wants to cross-examine God on God's plan and God's purpose. And what he's saying there is, I withdraw my question. I withdraw my objection. No further questions for you. Job says, I don't have to know. I don't have to control everything. I don't have to understand everything about who God is and why God does what God's done. I just have to know him. It's like some of you. You found out you needed to have surgery of one kind or another. If you find out that you are going to go under the knife, you understand, more important than fully grasping all of the hows of the surgery and all of the whats in the surgery and all of the whys even of the surgery, if you've got the right who, a lot of times that's all that matters for you. Even if you can't answer all of the wheres, whys, and hows, you can trust the right who. That's what Job says. And it's the first thing that he gets with a perspective of how big God is. The first thing that happens to him, he experiences a renewed confidence in God. A renewed confidence in God. Again, without ever getting to ask the why question. And before his circumstances change. You understand in Job chapter 42, the first couple of verses, Job's still suffering. He's still sitting there in the middle of a storm, scratching at his sores with a piece of broken pottery. He doesn't have all of his questions answered, but he's got a restored confidence in who God is. And he says, that's enough. That's not where the story ends. I love this. God speaks to Job's friends next. And he says, hey, fellas, I'm taking away your license to practice bad medicine. malpractice. You guys didn't tell Job the truth. You made his suffering worse, and you're in trouble with me, Job's friends. But I'm going to show you grace. You're not going to suffer bad karma. You deserve to. You haven't had enough faith in me, but I'm not going to smite you. Job's going to pray for you. I'm going to accept his prayer. And I'm not going to deal with you according to your folly. You understand? I'll remove the penalty of your guilt because of a righteous intercessor. That's what God tells Job's friends. Does that sound familiar to some of you who follow Jesus? Is that not exactly what God has done for us in the person of Jesus? We get this huge foreshadowing there. It's exactly what happens. Then look at verse 10. I love this. This is the first time I'd ever seen this, was studying for this sermon. Verse 10, after Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. Now check this out, underline it. This is important. This blows my mind. All his brothers and sisters and everyone who had known him before came and ate with him at his house. They comforted him and consoled him over all the trouble the Lord had brought on him, and each one gave him, check this out, a piece of silver and a gold ring. Wait, what? Okay, did you know that Job had brothers and sisters that were still alive and around during all of this suffering? I didn't know that. What about all of these friends who had silver pieces and gold rings that they could give away to him? Are you kidding me? Like, Job's homeless. He's scrounging for food. He's scratching at itches with pottery. He's miserable. And he has family in his life who aren't present. He has neighbors in his life with provision that they withhold from him throughout all of his suffering. And they show up with their gifts after God's already restored Job and given him twice as much as he had before. After Job doesn't need it anymore, that's when the neighbors show up. That's when the family shows up. Now, some of you have suffered before. I've suffered before. You know people like that? Did you have that same experience? I have. They're MIA in your pain, but they're fired up about showing up for your party. They're nowhere to be found in the middle of your misery, but they're eager to show up and share in the victory as if they'd been there all along. Are those people getting invited to your party? And I don't know about you, but I might have had an idea of some other places I would tell them to go and some other things that they could have done with their gifts. And you would have done the same thing, right? See, there's this thing that happens to us in the middle of our suffering as it relates to our sense of community. Isn't there something about suffering that when it comes to our community either instantly draws us together or it exposes the cracks in our relationships? If you've ever experienced the loss of a loved one, whether it was traumatic and immediate or it was a prolonged season of suffering, you know, sometimes those are really sweet times that God allows everybody to come together and the relationships grow stronger than they've ever been before. But sometimes it doesn't work that way. And in the midst of suffering, the people that you thought were close, the people that were family, becomes like Lord of the Flies. And you do, and we do, significant damage to each other in the middle of suffering by our absence or our unwillingness to help. Like we've said all throughout this series, sometimes we do all of that with the very best intentions. Job gets a perspective of the bigness of God, and he realizes that all along the way he's acted out of ignorance, that he did some things, Job did, and said some things in the middle of his suffering that weren't true and weren't helpful. And he received grace from the hand of God. And the more you receive grace, the more you recognize the grace that you've received from the hand of God, the more grace people around you should expect to receive from the hand of you. When you understand who you are and what God's done, It makes you willing to extend. That's what love requires of us. Isn't that what Jesus said? The one who's been forgiven much loves much. Job experiences restored community. Restored community. In light of the bigness of God, restored community. The friends that had hurt Job with their misery malpractice and the people who hadn't even bothered to show up at all, God invites Job to extend grace towards them in light of the grace that Job had received. And come on, some of us need to take that step today with someone who wasn't present in our suffering, or with someone who was present in all the worst ways. Somebody that burned us by something that they said when we were hurting, or someone who burned us by refusing to provide what we needed when we hurt. Everything in us wants to make them pay or to keep them at arm's length. Grace invites us to draw them in, to invite them to come near, not because they have a good explanation, not because they deserve it, explicitly because they don't. That's what love requires of us. One more thing. This is so cool. Job gets, and he gives us, a renewed focus for hope. A renewed focus for hope. Look at verse 12, Job 42, beginning in verse 12. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. He had, check this out, 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 donkeys, and he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. The first daughter he named Jemima. He put her over the syrup manufacturing business. The second, Keziah. The third, Karen Hapuk. Nowhere in all the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters. And, this is important, their father granted them an inheritance along with their brothers. Now, if I hadn't told you that was important, it wouldn't have taken your breath away. Because you didn't grow up in the ancient Near East, you're not familiar with this kind of custom. But if Moses read this story, if Paul had read this story, if Isaiah had read this story, when they got to that verse, it would have taken their breath away. They would have gasped. Because it wasn't the custom in anywhere in the ancient Near East for all of the kids to get an inheritance. The inheritance only went to one kid, and it never, ever, ever, ever went to the girl kid. And yet, Job gives an inheritance to all of his children. And he explicitly gave it to the females. All of the children of the father, male and female, young and old, all of them, received an inheritance in the end. Job's foreshadowing something here, isn't he? Don't miss it. One other thing that makes it even clearer what he's foreshadowing, you notice there it says that God blessed his life and he ended up with double what he had before. Okay, I was a music major, you understand that, explicitly so that I didn't have to do math, but even I can do this math. Okay, you go back to Job chapter 1 and compare what he started with what he ended with, it's sort of clear there. It says God blessed his life and gave him double what he had before. At the very beginning of the story, remember what he started with? Started with 7,000 sheep. At the end, what does it say he had? 14,000 sheep. Started with 3,000 camels. At the end, he's got 6,000 camels. 500 yoke of oxen. At the end, he ends up with 1,000 yoke of oxen. At the beginning, he starts with 500 donkeys. At the end, he has 1,000 donkeys. Now watch this. Before the suffering, he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. After the suffering, verse 13, it says he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. That math doesn't work out. Shouldn't it say, before the suffering he had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and after the suffering he had 14 sons and 6 daughters? Why didn't he have twice as many kids in place of the kids that he lost? Do you know the answer? You know why? Because the kids he lost weren't lost. It wasn't the end of their relationship. Because what happens to us here and now is not the end of the story. Not for those who trust in him. You see that? You see what's happening? Job's painting us a picture of a future restoration for every sufferer whose hope is in God. And he's showing us that Job grabbed a hold of it here and now, and he lived toward it with every day, even before he understood why. Now, you and I have to wait around 2,000 years for God's final answer to Job and sufferers like Job. Full and complete proof that the worst kind of suffering that you and I could imagine, the senseless suffering, torture, and death of God himself, can shatter the darkness, reverse the curse, and bring the hope of dawn to a broken world that suffers in darkness. It's 2,000 years before we see something that proclaims once and for all that suffering is not eternal. The God of wonders is. Suffering doesn't get to write the last chapter of our story. God of wisdom does. Relief and answers and explanations and vindication will never, ever satisfy us fully. Only the all-sufficient God will. And someday, one day, all suffering will be taken away. The God who is present never will. See, it leaves us with one gigantic question in a sea of other questions that fall in behind it. It's not the question why or what or even when or how. Those are all important questions. They're worthwhile questions. Ask those questions. They're necessary and acceptable questions. They're not the biggest question. The biggest question is, who will receive your trust while you wait to understand more fully? Job decides, shouldn't be me. I'm going to trust in the God who's bigger and stronger and wiser than me, with me. Because even though it may not look like it today, or feel like it today, or seem like it today, he's for me. He's good, and he's near. God didn't stay distant from human suffering. Even senseless, unjust, unexplainable suffering. He came near, not just to see it, but to suffer it himself. So that when you suffer without relief, and you feel absolutely alone in your suffering, you can know that because he bore your sin, he will be with you. He's walked this path. He knows the way out. And wherever the path goes, however long it takes, even if the path you're on doesn't take you to why, it'll always take you to him. And when you see him, when you really see him, you'll realize, like Job, he's enough. Will you pray with me? Father, some of us, even in this moment, are arguing with Job's conclusion because it doesn't feel like enough. Lord, would you give us courage to ask you the questions that we've got and not to come to conclusions about things that we don't understand, but to see clearly who you are even when we hurt, and to sense that you're near even when we feel alone. Would you lead us back to truth with a capital T that's found in the person of Jesus, who came to the earth to endure suffering for us, to take your punishment so that we would never have to. And would you let us in this moment, either for the first time or again, place our trust in him. Lord, I pray for the person that's never realized that in this moment, that for the very first time, they would put their trust in a Jesus who came and died for them and rose from the dead to offer them everlasting life and his presence for every single step, even when we walk through a broken world where we suffer senselessly. And Lord, for those of us who have already trusted you, I pray that we would walk as if you're a God we can have confidence in. We would walk in community, even though community lets us down so often because of who you are and the grace we've received. Let us be people that extend it. And let us be people that walk with our head held high, even when it's hard down here, because we know that this place and this suffering and this season, it's not the end of our story. Would you let us walk with comfort and hope wherever we go, whatever it's like. In Jesus' name, amen.